Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 282 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Today we're thrilled to have a remarkable guest with us, Karen Moore. Karen has an impressive skill set and she's here to pull back the curtain so we can peek into a specific skill set, facilitating critical incident debriefing groups. So stay to the end to hear her fascinating insight. And as always, I'm joined by Ken. Ken, how are you doing today?
Yeah, great. I'm well. Thank you for asking, Rory. Episode 282, as Rory has mentioned, and we got 3 stops. Of course, you've already heard about the amazing interview with Karen Moore, but we're going to start off with student services, where today we're going to be looking at choosing and using academic texts during the arc of your study. And I think this applies post-qualification as well. We often turn back to those texts, and there's some great tips that we'll share with you today. We then go into ethical sustainable I don't know what that was. Ethical sustainable practice sounded like pineapple Danish there. Ethical sustainable practice, where we're going to be speaking about counselling from home. It has some benefits. Could it have some drawbacks? Let's dig into that one. And then, of course, Practice Matters, the CPD section, where we're going to be hearing that amazing interview with Karen Moore. Let's kick off, Rory. Student services, recognizing that student journey. We have to turn to our textbooks. We get recommended reading lists, but wow, there's a lot of reading there. I'm looking at my daughter, she's at uni, and quite honestly, I'm going to be honest with you, if she had to read all of the recommended reading books for her course from cover to cover, it would take more time than she has actually within university, Rory. Choosing and using academic texts. Have got any tips for us?
Well, strangely enough, Ken, yes, I have. So straight off the bat, the reason I've chosen this topic is because it's come up time and time again in our Facebook group. And I'm sure if you're a regular listener, you'll know about our Facebook group. But if you just joined us, type Counselling Tutor into Facebook, you'll find us, and you too can see all the wonderful conversations that go on. But yes, time and reading, you're absolutely right. If I read everything on the reading list for my course, I've still got my reading list for the course I did, I wouldn't have had any time to actually either attend classes or do anything else, or even work for that matter, because there was such big text. And one of the things I learned very quickly is that academic textbooks are different from the books you take on holiday. So if we go on holiday, I buy a book, and I'll start at the beginning and finish at the end, and it'll be nice. It might take me the week, and very good. With academic textbooks, you don't start at the beginning. You start at the back in the index. That's the first tip. So when you're being asked to answer criteria or to write an assignment, the best thing to do is look at what you're being asked. So take a very, very, very simple question. Define what empathy is. So what you're asking to do really is to give a view on what empathy is. So the key word here is empathy. So you're in the back of your textbook, you work your way down, and in the index until you found empathy, and you read those chapters. You read those bits. That is what you're going to use to form the underpin of your assignment. You don't start at the front of the book in the hope that at some point you may stumble across empathy. What you're doing is you're going directly, you're putting, as they say, the meat on the bone, and you're looking at empathy. And that is the way you use academic textbooks. And if I look at my academic textbook, if I put the spine in my hand and hold it up, I'll notice that some of the pages are more open. You know, the book opens to some pages more than others. And that is because I've been looking at specific things. I download my book now on Kindle, and it's noticeable when I bookmark, I have a section of bookmarks on my Kindle reader with the areas that I'm looking at. Not the whole book, just the areas that I'm looking at. Now, it might be in the fullness of time, I think, oh, I'll just read a couple of other chapters. There might be something useful in that. But really, the academic textbooks are a means to an end. They're the tools that allow you to answer the criteria, to gain the understanding, to answer the criteria, to be able to put your paper in, or to be able to put theory to practice. They're not holiday reading. And I think that's probably, for people who are just coming into study, probably that's the biggest learning, I think, Ken.
I think that's a great learning, Rory, and I know that doesn't necessarily apply to all, and I say that because I know you, Rory, like nothing more than to devour an academic book, and I've seen you devour a few in their entirety, cover to cover. So it could be that it is your thing, but it certainly is not for me. And I like how you've distinguished between academic reference reading and what you might read in your spare time. And you can read counselling related books in your spare time. And you mentioned the Facebook group. Often there are sharings of books, things like Counselling for Toads, Why the Caged Bird Sings, Love's Executioner. There's some books that are read because they nourish the counselling journey. However, it's an academic process when you're studying counselling. And within academia, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We are building and learning about the work that those before us have paved. And we want to be referencing what we're learning. So we're evidence, yes, we understand this learning, but we want to be referencing or paying homage to where the theory originated. Who was that? Where did they write about that? Was it a paper? Was it within a book? So we're actually referencing back. So it is a reference process when you are using the textbooks. And I like how you said, Rory, you go to the back of the book, you go to the index, you go and look for the topic or the subject that you are studying. And I think back to my own assignments, my desk was absolutely full of books everywhere. It was a little bit before the time of internet availability of books, or if maybe they were around, but I certainly didn't have the skill set to use them. And there was little sticky notes in the pages that I knew, and I would get, and I would say, okay, this is theory. And I had within my textbooks marked out the theory pages, and I would go, okay, this is comparing to Gestalt. Now I'm going to grab the Gestalt book and go to the theory section. And I think that's another great tip, is when you do have a textbook, there's nothing wrong with having a quick look over the textbook, understanding what kind of stuff is in there. So have a look at the table of content within the book. That is there to serve as kind of a memory jog. You might be sitting in a lesson, tutor lecturing on something, and they say a word and you go, oh, hold on, where have I seen that before? Oh, that's in such a book. That gives you the opportunity to go away from that lecture, go to such a book, go and find that using the table of contents or the index at the back, and look at that topic in a little bit more depth. And I think that is a great use for an academic textbook, because they can be pretty dry. They can be pretty difficult to read. And I have to say, studying person-centered therapy during my studies, I found some of Roger's work pretty difficult to read. However, I also have to say his later work, specifically his last book, A Way of Being, that I read, I actually loved that, and I read it. I found that I could read it from cover to cover, and it felt like he'd taken on a different style there. So It's about where you find yourself. And I guess all of this comes second. First is find out what the reading list is. Find out what books you should have around you. And when you look to those books, they can be pretty expensive. So have a look around and see, are there other ways of getting hold of the books? You mentioned, Rory, Kindle as an example. And a lot of the academic books are available in different formats, some more expensive than others. So there are cheaper ways of doing it. And there are some books that you can also pick up secondhand. However, Rory, tell us what we need to watch out for if we are saying, oh, right, I'm going to get a secondhand book.
Well, yes, thanks for that segue, Ken. Yes. So on the whole, theory doesn't change. So if you're buying books written by Eric Byrne or Carl Rogers or Albert Ellis or whoever you're studying, Patricia Clarkson, their theory doesn't change. If they've written it, that's their theory. It doesn't matter if they wrote it 20 years ago or 10 years ago. That's the theory. And unless the theorist has rewritten parts of their book, which is, in my experience, kind of highly unlikely, then that is the book. And I've got books that are 20, 30 years old that I bought secondhand. I would go into my local bookshop and buy, what I call a handful of books, 5 or 6 books, just for reference, just for academic reference. Certainly when I was lecturing, just to get a wide view of the subject I was studying. But there are some books that we really need to buy up to date. What are those books? Well, any book on ethics. There's different books. There's a standards and ethics book, which is very famous. It's by Tim Bond, Standards and Ethics in Counselling by Professor Tim Bond. And that gets updated periodically. And I would really strongly advise you to buy the latest edition of that, because ethical frameworks change. And if you're quoting ethical frameworks from a book and opinions from a book, then you need to make sure that they're quoting the up-to-date framework or professional framework. And I think the same goes for legislation. We don't have a lot of legislation in counselling, but we do have some, in terms of confidentiality, where we're allowed to break confidentiality, and also legislation about 2010 legislation about counselling people who have been adopted. There's some legislation there. So make sure that if it's a book on legal opinion, there's quite a few books on legal opinion, make sure it's up to date, because again, things change. But generally speaking, a look round the bookshop. Here's a good tip. If you're in town, if you go to a new town, always go in to the Oxfam shop or the charity shops that are around, and you can pick up some real bargains. You'd be amazed at the books I've picked up. And some of them are literally brand new. So if you find an area with a university, so here's another top tip. If you have a look if there's a university, and if you visit in that area, visit the charity shops. And, if you visit them, maybe kind of, I don't know, June, July, when the students have probably finished their studies and they may be getting rid of the books, you can find some belting books. Storming and belting, that's a very northern phrase, isn't it? Storming and belting book, very Mancunian that. And you can get them at a fraction of the price. And of course, they're sold on eBay, they're sold on trading sites. So you don't have to spend a fortune, but they are expensive. Some of them are very expensive, Ken.
They are. And another place, if you're looking for used books, is Counselling Tutor Facebook group. We often see somebody, they've graduated and they pop their books on. We're not a bookshop, but we do from time to time let somebody post their books. So you might pick something up over there. And you mentioned the importance of that new versus the old editions when you're talking about legislation, when you're talking about ethics. And I think there's a view beyond that as well. And it's knowing what is going on outside of the textbook, specifically if something has changed. So there was an update of at least the BACP ethical framework was it 2018, Rory? Am I remembering that correctly? And perhaps, word is out there that they may be looking to update that again. Why? Because things are changing. AI has just come in. There's maybe new considerations. So if you're writing about ethics, go to an ethical body and download the latest ethical framework and make sure you're at least having a look over that and referencing it, so you're not quoting out-of-date information. Even a book written a year ago might change. And of course, there was a massive change here in the UK when GDPR was introduced. It was a way of protecting, storing and managing data. And of course, as counselors, as psychotherapists, we are managing what is called specialist data, because it may contain medical records. Somebody might tell us what medication they use, or that they've been in a previous mental health service, and that automatically makes the information fall into a specific category. Now, that was a European law, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, that came into effect. And when the UK moved away, the United Kingdom moved away from Europe. It was called Brexit. Should have been in the news near you.
I didn't see it, Ken.
I saw nothing else for a number of years. There was a further change where it moved from GDPR to UK GDPR. And although there are many similarities, there are also some differences there. So just being aware of what is happening legislatively or ethically with an ethical body, I think is really, really important. And I look back to 2021 when we went into the COVID. There was the lockdown. There was a big move to online and telephone counselling. And coming out of that, there was a recognition that maybe online and telephone counselling needed its own framework or its own set of kind of criteria that we can base training on. And so things are changing all the time. So it's always good when you have your academic books just to look a little further than that and ask yourself the question, is this still relevant today? So if it's Carl Rogers' 19 propositions, is it still relevant today? Yeah, because he hasn't done any updates. I can promise you that. 19 propositions remains the 19 propositions. But an ethic or a law or an expectation of how we might practice could change. So just be aware that outside of the textbook, there may be some additional information to look at there. And then, of course, if we're speaking about academic books, we can't leave the topic without speaking about referencing. And again, we hear so much about how referencing can trip one up. It can. You can have an assignment sent back and referred with the information correct, but references being incorrect. And referencing can be tricky. What might we do, Rory, to help us reference?
Well, I think there's, first of all, I think any good training establishment would give exemplars out
Yes.
so that you can see how referencing is. It's writing academically should be taken as that someone else will read out your assignment. So that's why we ask to write academically. So in the when it's read out, it is kind of slightly dispassionate, slightly takes away from the you to getting into. This is what was said. This is the information, and within that, you may have different views on that information. I've certainly, he talks about empathy. There's certainly different opinions on empathy and how empathy is used. And in fact, empathy, we have idiosyncratic empathy, we now have double empathy when we work with those people in the neurodiverse or neurodivergent space. So I think sometimes your books need to reference not just the classical ideas, but perhaps the newer ideas. But when we're talking about actual referencing, gone are the days when you have to write long references in your reference list. You can use a lot of tools. I use Bibly, which is a very, very good tool. It's free online. And all you do is you just type in the book and it produces the reference for you. No problem at all with that. Totally correct. Saves lots of time. And I can guarantee you, your tutor will be eternally grateful when you use it, because it means you don't have to go around and say, as I've said, and I know you've said it many occasions, Ken, actually the reference is incorrect. So the first thing, Try and get an exemplar of what the referencing looks like. Your organisation should be able to give you that. And secondly, save yourself some time and use an online referencing generator. And you just put the book in and click the button, go and get yourself a cup of tea, come back, and it's developed not only the reference you can put in your reference section, but also the in-text referencing. So Rogers, and then your brackets, and then 1953, and then close your brackets will then come up as well. So you get your in-text references. So it's really, really important to have a kind of holistic approach to this. The right books, but also the right way of explaining and how you reference the text that you've read.
Yeah, and it all starts with finding out what the referencing requirements are, as you beautifully said there, Rory. You know, we started this by saying get the reading list, understand what the books are that you need to know, and understand how your references need to look. Is it Havard referencing? Is it a different kind of referencing? So that if you are looking up an online referencing generator or a tool, you're looking at the right one. You don't want to be going into Google and say online reference generator, because you're kind of spinning a wheel of what kind of references it might be generating. And there are many. I looked on the Manchester University website at referencing, and there are many more ways of referencing than I've had hot dinners, Rory. There really are. So using the right online referencing generator is correct. And if you put the right search term in, and that can be found from your learning institution of what you're required, you're more likely to get a reference generator that's gonna match what you're doing. Generate a reference with a reference generator and then check it. Rory said, get an exemplar. Does it look the same as the one that my tutor gave me and said, here's an example? Does it look the same? Is it the same kind of format? Because it is important you're being asked to reference. And you know, at the end of the day, academia is a big spider web. One paper references and links to another paper. It is the body of work that builds over time, where the research is done, where the work is put in, and it references what has come before, and then there might be some new work in that is then peer evaluated, and then you might be referencing that paper when you were doing your research. And so it builds up this massive spider web of what has come before, and all the references kind of point back to the origin. All the way back. If you follow one reference back to a previous paper, that's going to have a reference to where they got information and what they found. So it offers a robustness. It means that there has been a lot of eyes, that peer review process over the whole arc of the development of that theory and how we practice and what we practice, how we present ourselves. So that's, I guess, what the references are there for. So when you see them in the books, when you see them on the handouts that you might get from Counselling Tutor, because we always include the references of where the information comes from, you now understand why so many of our lectures in our counselling study resource and in our CPD library, there's probably one or two slides at the end of each lecture just on references. And I used to look at references as, that's the boring bit, I don't need to worry about that. It is the origin. It is where the information came from. It's actually quite interesting. So anything else on books, Rory, before we kind of back out?
Yes. Yeah, well, I think I'd like to go back to the notion of there are some books that are just nourishing to read. I personally wouldn't read Client-Centered Therapy by Carl Rogers from cover to cover, but I would read A Way of Being from cover to cover, because Rogers' writing had changed. The Way of Being is more what we call a polemic, which is a critique and a pithy observation of the world. And I would really encourage anybody to read A Way of Being. And I'd challenge you to not think it wasn't written last week. It's still up to date. 85 it was published, just before his death in 87. And there are lots of other books that we can draw from and quote from that we can read cover to cover. And we talk about Love's Executioner, Counselling for Toads. You know, there's so many really lovely books. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Wonderful, rich learning about diversity and difference. And we, On the Road by Jack Kerouac, I've read that. Lots of really interesting books, which gives us, I think it gives us a added flavour to what we're studying. I think that the academic ingredients can sometimes not be very fulfilling. And I think sometimes we need just to put a little soup song of other things in our reading to bring it to life, to get that taste and that deep texture. I'm on a food trip at the moment, I think, Ken. And I think it's about being widely read. I've always said that, if you're widely read, you really can't go wrong, because you not only have you got the kind of raw information, but you've also got the context that it sits in. And I think, I think that anybody who's interested in the world of counselling and psychotherapy, I think that's essential. Yeah. So as an avid reader, just don't stop. Just keep getting those books and keep reading them. Definitely.
Well said, Rory. And I love how you related it to the spice, those additional books that nourish during your journey. And feel free to drop little bits of that spice into your assignments. Feel free to reference those other books as well, not just your reading list. So yes, you want to be referencing your reading list. You want to be showing that you're following the curriculum, doing the reading that you should do. But those little extra books, those side books that you mentioned, Rory, those nourishing books, they do add spice, and not only to your own learning, but they can add spice to your assignment work as well that you hand in. There it is. That is some tips on academic books. We have a super duper handout that has been made up just for you, which covers just the simplicity of what we've spoken about today. It's 5 big tips that are written for you on how to use academic books for your assignments. It's for students of counselling and psychotherapy. You can get it. It's free of charge. Just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go to episode 282. That's today's podcast. Right there on the page, download it, print it out, have it beside you, add it to your study file. And that brings us to the end of Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counsellingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your Counselling Tutor discount. That's counsellingskillsacademy.com. And as we kind of leave Student Services, we go into ESP. Is that mind reading? No, it's ethical, sustainable practice, he says, with a smile on his face. And this is where we recognize those counsellors who start a private practice or grow a private practice or are involved or thinking of starting a private practice. We try to look at areas that might not be covered within the counselling formal study journey that are important to running a practice. And one of the considerations that comes up so often about starting a private practice is room hire. Do I go out and do I hire a room, or if I have space in my home, could I run it from home? And I think it depends. And what you want to be doing is making a list of pros and cons. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the benefits and drawbacks of counselling from your own home.
Yes, absolutely, Ken. And I think this is the ethical part of it for me. So in 2016, when I left my role as senior lecturer at a college teaching counselling, part of my move into self-employment was to set up my own private practice. And I have to say, right at the get-go, this was before online and telephone counselling was mainstream. So it was there, but it wasn't as mainstream as it was. The pandemic changed everything. And as we know now, we live in a mixed economy of online and in-the-room therapy. So I decided it might be useful to counsel from home. So I thought, well, the best thing I can do here is, think about it from the client's point of view, and think about what are the advantages and drawbacks counselling from home? Well, the immediate advantage is cost. I wouldn't have to hire a room, and convenience. I wouldn't have to drive anywhere. So those were the two benefits. And then I started looking at the drawbacks, of which I found there were quite a few. Now, the first thing is I live in a wonderful area, wonderful part of the world called Mosley, where the people are kind, thoughtful, and shall we say vigilant. They're very vigilant, the people who live in my streets. And it's quite often that I might have someone say, do you know, there was someone knocking at your door the other day? And oh, thank you very much. And you know, I certainly have colleagues visit me, and I recently had a female colleague visit me, and someone said to my wife, "Do you know there was a woman going in your house?" Yeah. It's like being in the 1950s, isn't it? And so I thought, well, you know, I'm very grateful if there's anybody listening in my life for their vigilance, but you know, I think that could be a difficulty. The second was the fact that my house isn't easily accessible by a wheelchair, and being Counselling Towers has a very steep, you know, baroque staircase. Could be quite difficult for someone to access the bathroom, and you know, clients may want to use the bathroom. You can't say no, you can't. So I put that on my drawback tick list. And then there was just the practical elements. My home is my home, and it's got pictures of my family, so I'd have to take those down. And also, there was a strong objection from Mrs. Counselling Tutor, who was very, shall we say, vocal about people, and I quote, traipsing in and out of her house. So as I share the house with my wife, and it's her house as much as mine, I decided that on the balance, probably working from home wasn't for me. But that was because of a specific set of circumstances. You know, the thing is, there's a lot of people who work from home, and it would depend on the circumstances. I know you for a time worked from home, Ken.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you, Rory. I did. And you know, looking back during my studies, my supervisor worked from home. When I moved supervisors, my second supervisor worked from home. When I did my own personal counselling during my studies, the counsellor that I chose worked from home. And they were properly set up, ideal settings for working from home. So there are benefits. You've mentioned them, Rory, and cost is a great one. Comfort for yourself. You know, there's no traveling to work, back from work if you're in your own home. So the benefits, I guess, do kind of speak for themselves. Depending on how you've set up your accounts and how you've registered your business, there is sometimes you are able to claim a portion of money for the electricity that is burnt to keep your room warm within your home. You'd need to look at that with your accountant or bookkeeper, because there is a very fine balance there. But yes, the drawbacks, and I think the drawbacks are you've said it, Rory, and the word curtain twitchers came to mind. And
I never said that about my neighbours, Ken.
No. Well, I'm definitely not thinking about your neighbours here, Rory, he says very defensively. So curtain twitchers is kind of a slang word for people that any noise they hear out in the street or wherever it may be, they might be looking through their curtains. And it depends. Will the person be seen? Will there be confidentiality? Can that person arrive, have their session, and leave and feel that they're not being observed, watched, looked at during that process? Yeah, there is one consideration. Where might they park their car? Is it easy to park the car, or are there times when all the parking is gone and it's on street parking? They may have to walk for some distance. Have a think about that, what that looks like, and then think what that looks like if the person has a mobility impairment that makes it difficult for them to walk a long distance. Do you have access, an accessible practice? Can somebody who does have a mobility challenge access your property and your facilities? As you mentioned, Rory, the bathroom. And so often we can put our sole focus on the counseling room. So I've got a spare room in my house. It's going to be ideal. We're not using it. It is the counseling room. I go in there, I design it, I pick the wallpaper, I pick the clock that doesn't tick. The tissues are out, the great, nice, comfy chairs are there. I look, you can't see into this room, which is great. Everything is private, everything is confidential. This is, for me, the perfect counseling room. I post the pictures with my peers and say, look at my counseling room. That's great. What is the journey to your counseling room like? Does the person need to walk past other parts of your house? How do they get in? So if they're walking up a flight of stairs with your family pictures over the walls, what is that saying to that person? And I guess that's not what we would have if we hired a room. I know that there are other considerations that you might not think about, and this happened to me. I did counsel from home, I did have access, I did have parking, I had satisfied myself that the journey into the counselling room was blank and nondescript, and it was respectful for the clients. The bathroom is accessible from my counselling room, but I was sat there one day with a client. We'd come to the end of our session, and suddenly somebody appeared at my window. Now, I'm a floor up. You can't appear one floor up at the window. It was a window cleaner who had changed their day because there had been some bad weather, and suddenly I was looking at the client was looking at the window, and I saw a strange look on the client's face that prompted me to look over my shoulder, and sure enough, there was a happy chap smiling and cleaning the window and kind of waving to me. So it's those kind of considerations, things that we don't necessarily think about. What happens if a parcel arrives? If you're the only person in the home? If you're not the only person in the home, can somebody else overhear you? Can the client overhear that there's somebody else in the home as they're coming in? Can they hear a clatter in the kitchen? Do they then feel maybe somebody can overhear me, even if they can't? And then another consideration is, if you are working from your own home, how do you work your waiting room policy? So if you have one client and you're seeing a client straight thereafter, and your second client is early, what do they do? How does that work? And it can be managed, but it needs to be thought about. It needs to be taken to supervision, and you need to work out what the pros and cons are for you, relevant to your home and your practice, and I guess make the decision from that, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some other things that have kind of come into my awareness as you were speaking. If you're working from home, you are in fact lone working, and maybe we'll do a podcast on lone working at some point. But you're lone working now. I don't want to scare people, and generally speaking, I've worked with hundreds of clients, maybe thousands of clients, and I can count on the finger of one hand those who may have had some difficulty with, say, anger, or may have attended under the influence of substances, or may have just been, shall we say, a little odd. Let's be real. You're dealing with the full panoply of humanity. And I'm a male counsellor. I'm quite a big guy, so the fear for me is probably less. And I don't want to go down too far down this rabbit hole of, if I wasn't who I was, I may feel a bit more vulnerable. And I've had female colleagues, and I'm not saying all female colleagues feel the same as this by any stretch of the imagination, but I've felt just a little bit vulnerable about being, on their own with maybe a male client. So that's the first thing to consider. And the lone working policy, how do you make sure that you're safe? And I think we'll cover that in another episode. And I did say right at the start of this, right at the top of this piece, that I don't work from home. That's not actually true. What happened was when the pandemic came, of course, nobody could work in their practices. So the online and telephone counselling became mainstream. And I find myself today working from home. The difference is I have a dedicated room. I use my office here, which is sometimes referred to as the studio, because that's why we recorded the podcast. And it's got a backdrop. It's developed specifically for, if I want to do some counselling. It's a respectful online space. But more to the point, all the family refer to it as my office. Even my little granddaughter Izzy says, "Can I come in your office, Granddad?" And I go, "Yeah, come on in." And it's a space where I can leave and go back into the rest of the house and re-engage with the family. So if I'm working with something which is really heavy duty, I can leave it in this space and go back into my life. And that's something that you really need to consider if you're working from home, I think, because if you have something that touches you personally, or is, sometimes we work with really, really tragic and sad presentations, and the ability to decompress, the ability to be able to get in your car from your practice, drive home, get out of your car, just decompress, listen to the radio, just decompress. When you get home, you're back in your home. You don't get that luxury when you're working from home. There's no decompression. And I would strongly, strongly ask people, take it to supervision and think about, if you are working from home and you're working in your house, how do you decompress when something touches you personally, or you've heard some really heavy material which you just can't shake off, and it's in your home? Yeah, so important.
It is, and I love that you've brought in online and telephone working, because you may then well be working within your home, and I think that we can definitely schedule another ESP, ethical sustainable practice, and speak about online and telephone working, because there are some parameters, even if you are working from your own home, some considerations to take in there. And it's things like, I don't know, have you got a dog? Have you got a dog? I've got 3 dogs.
No.
And if our postman comes to the door, boy, do you hear about it. The dogs make a lot of noise. How I manage that if I'm even online or even in a room with a client? What do I do? Oh, sorry, I've got dogs that are barking in the background. And maybe it's just about thinking of that. And I wanted to leave with one final thought on this. And it's really interesting as I go into this final thought. We said the pros and cons of working from your own home, and I just feel we've spent a lot of time on the cons, and maybe that's because home working looks so appealing, I guess.
Yes.
And maybe you can work. There's many pros, and I worked from home for many years, from my home for many years, very successfully. But one of them is to consider, if you work in either online, so this wouldn't happen if you were working online, and it wouldn't happen if you were working in a hired room or a professional space that was kind of paid for counselling outside of your own property, then you wouldn't have a client knocking on your door at 3:00 in the morning if they were in massive distress. Because there's a consideration, and it is really unlikely, but these are the considerations that you would have to take into your contract and talk about to avoid that happening, the no contact outside of hours. And I think there's been some films that I've seen where the client arrives at the house and at an inappropriate time because they're in distress. What are we going to do? I'm going to go see my counsellor because they're just 2 blocks away, or whatever it is. Or what would happen if you get a knock at the door in your home time, and it's perchance an abusive partner of one of your clients who's found out that they're going and seeing this person once a week. Who are you and why are you seeing my partner? How do you answer that question? I'm not saying that's going to happen, and it's really unlikely, but these are the considerations, and going down the roads of, hoping for the best, but planning for what you do in the worst situations. And that's part of making that pros and cons list of where you're going to base your practice and what that's going to look like, what that's going to feel like. It defines your practice, I guess. That's ethical, sustainable practice. Get into the Facebook group, Facebook Counselling Tutor. Join in this discussion and share your thoughts, your feelings on this topic. And we move out of our ethical, sustainable practice. We're going to Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is where you claim those CPD points. And we're talking about critical incident debriefing here, Rory, with Karen Moore. You met up with Karen to discuss this really important topic.
I did, and it just goes to show there's so many opportunities once you're a qualified counsellor, and as you'll hear, Karen talks about one opportunity she took up, which has been a very useful and very interesting set of work that she's undertaken through the years. So I spoke to Karen on Critical Incident Debriefing, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
I think one of the beauties of having a counselling qualification is that it can open doors to work that may not have been in our awareness, really interesting and rewarding work, and work that sometimes involves a lot of planning and thinking about. So I'm delighted to welcome as my guest Karen Moore, who is a former student colleague of mine, now a fully qualified and gloriously well-qualified colleague. Karen, welcome so much for joining us.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, happy to be here.
So we're going to be talking about this interesting piece of work that you do. It's critical incident debriefing. But before we do that, can you just tell us a little bit about your kind of counselling journey from maybe when you decided to become a counsellor and what you've done in the years after you've qualified?
Yeah, of course. I decided after having therapy of my own that if I could help somebody the same way as I'd been helped, then I wanted to go down that counselling journey. So joined up on the level 2 at the local college, then 3, and then I did level 4, and I qualified in 2015. From there, I went on to do a qualification in CBT. Then I did some work with Stop SO, so working with sex offenders. I also did a qualification in critical incident debriefing, and then I went on to do EMDR, and also I've got my supervision qualification as well. So I haven't rested much.
No, I was going to say you need to get out and do a bit more, really. Yeah. What have you been up to with your time? Yeah. I mean, it's a incredible career progression, and I think that one that shows real dedication to the work, and of course the people who you serve are ultimately the clients. And you said in that you did a qualification in critical incident debriefing. Just tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, it was just some. I was working because all the way through I've had my own private practice, but at times I did do work as an employee, and one of the companies that I worked for said, would I be interested in doing this qualification? So yeah, I went to a place in York and I did my critical incident debriefing, which it's the Mitchell model that we learnt, and from there I've gone on to put that into practice by going in places and helping when things go wrong.
Yes, and I think that brings us nicely on to, what actually is critical incident debriefing. What are the circumstances that would ask somebody to come in and to critically incident debrief people? What would the process of that be? What would have happened?
Okay, so something significant that happened, something that's potentially traumatic for people. So things like the Manchester bombing, London Bridge stabbing, things that happen in prisons or incidents. It's basically where you've got a group of people that have been either witnessed or involved in something horrific that you wouldn't generally want to be involved in. And the the purpose is to go in there to give psychoeducation around how things can affect you, what to look out for, and how best to deal with any symptoms and things like that to deal with. So yeah, usually you go in no earlier than 48 hours because they need at least 48 hours to be able to, react and, the normal processing. So usually between 48 and 72 hours you get sent in to help with the people involved.
And I guess at some point somebody's going to have to make a decision that a critical incident debrief is needed. So, say we were to take an incident in an office where somebody was stabbed. I'm sorry if this is triggering for people, but this is the reality of the work that you do, isn't it? And lots of people witnessed that. There was lots of confusion. There was lots of panic, and obviously, person was apprehended, or maybe not apprehended. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and the person was then taken for medical attention. All the people around there would have suffered some form, or a lot may have suffered some form of trauma in different degrees witnessing that. Yeah. So who would it be who actually picks the phone up and thinks we need to do something about this?
It tends to be the managers of the place where it's happened, or whoever's involved with looking after the staff that were involved, and they usually pick up the phone and go to their EAP and ask the EAP if they've got anything that can help with that. And that's usually when people that have been qualified like myself will be approached and asked to go and help in that area.
So an EAP is the Employment Assistance Programme, perhaps best known for, if someone's having a difficulty personally, they would go to the Human Resources Department, or maybe referred to the Human Resources Department. Someone says you're going through a really difficult time, and as an organisation we want to support you, and they would be referred to an EAP, and the EAP would pick that up then, may offer counselling or appropriate interventions for a certain length of time. So it would be a human resources or a managerial function. Yeah. Now, when we come to, and I know you can't speak about specifics of the groups that you have facilitated, but as a general observation, are there different dynamics that play out in groups? I mean, some groups, I guess, are going to be traumatized, but is there a case sometimes where groups are a little bit kind of embattled, where members of the group maybe blame another member of the group or the organisation? And how do you work with that?
Okay, so the first thing you do when you go in is you get a list of the names of the people that were involved, and you'd split it into 3 groups. So you'd have the people that were actually witnessed and were, actually saw what happened. And then the second group would be the people that were like your first responders, the people that came in after the event had happened. And then the third group would be the people that have been affected, maybe knew the person that was, as you said, stabbed or whatever. So then you deal with them, and you'd keep them separate wherever possible. So as not to, cause the traumatization. Because if somebody hasn't witnessed it and then they start hearing all the details, then that can cause issues. But yeah, I have been to them before where the fight flight's kicked in, and you've got 2 first aiders who you would hope would be responding to that, as you said, stabbing, but one of them, their fight flights kicked in, and it was, I'm running in the opposite direction, and another one that goes straight into it, and then it can end up with a bit of conflict between the 2. But that's where the psychoeducation comes in, because explaining to them how we respond to trauma and how the fight, flight, freeze, flop, we don't have a choice. So you might have somebody who is in the middle of a fight, and the big burly bouncer kind of bloke runs in the opposite direction, and somebody else who maybe you would think would run but didn't. So you don't have a choice, and it's making them aware of that. And I think that helps then to support and open up the conversation between the people that are maybe in conflict.
Yes, and I think that brings up an interesting point, doesn't it? As a general observation, we expect people like first responders and fire service personnel and the police and, uniformed services, shall we say, to almost, we don't say it explicitly, but sometimes we ask them to be almost immune to the natural human tendency of fear. And I, speaking for myself, I think it doesn't matter how well trained you are, everybody has a trigger point. Once that limbic system of the brain kicks in, that's it. You're not going to slip it out of gear until it decides to do it itself.
Yeah, massively. And I think, having the part of the conversation that we have with the people is, we start off with the psychoeducation type of things that they might expect that they would feel or not feel. There's no right or wrong, but mainly it's, that it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, and to take the pressure off. And that's really important, because I think people then, they feel like they can relax a little bit because it's normal, but it's not a normal situation.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's an abnormal situation, and people can go through training and drills, but until it actually happens, as my father said, he was a military man, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And I'm not saying that the people are traumatized at the enemy, but the idea I'm trying to get across is you can train and plan and strategize, but when it actually happens, you are in the hands of individuals whose psychology and automotive nervous system kicks in, and you don't know. You can't really plan for that. You can't train people with real stabbings, real bomb explosions. You can simulate it. So it's part of that. So is there any part of the work where you may be in part of a legal process? You talked about London bombing, you talked about stabbings. Is there part of that where you may be brought to maybe a coroner's court or have to make a report to anybody?
That's always a possibility, but touch wood, I haven't as yet. And to be fair, we don't report back, and that's one of the things that we say to people. What happens in the room stays in the room. Normal confidentiality applies, obviously, but nothing's going to be going back to managers around, these have been saying this or doing this, or they're angry with you for this or whatever. So it is normal. You have to put your normal confidentiality in, but it is making it that them feel comfortable enough to be able to talk if they want to, but there's no pressure for them to do so. So they can see you. We always have at the end of the debrief is you have a room on your own, so that people can come and find you one by one if they felt that they couldn't talk while they were there, and making sure that they've got the support afterwards. Quite often you'll do the initial critical incident debrief and then go back in again like the following week, as with a room of being one-to-one, so as people can come, a bit of a drop-in, so that people can come and help, and get the help if they need it.
Sure. Is there any cases where you may see someone who's gone through the critical incident debrief process and realise that they may need some extra support, maybe need some therapy. Yeah. What's the process there?
Usually, depending on how the referrals come through, but usually it would be advising them to get in touch with their EAP, if that's where it's come through, or their manager, asking them to contact their manager or the GP if they're wanting to keep it external, and ask the GP for further support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess my final question is, what does it demand of you, the person who's facilitating it? How do you take care of yourself when you're in a process of all these people who, some of them may be traumatized? What do you put in place to take care of you?
Probably dissociation. No. It is. It's hard, and I think for me, I am very good at putting those routines in place. I'm going in, I'm putting this shield on, I'm going in as a therapist, I'm going in to do a job, and then I have do the process, because you've got to think on your feet. You really have got to think on your feet when you're doing it. Because like you said, you can have conflicts of people. Why didn't you do that? Why did you do that? So you've got to be able to navigate that as well. So be confident in what you're doing. And then at the end of it, I have a critical incident debrief. So with another therapist. So I'll debrief the debrief, if that makes sense. And I'll go through what I've found, how it affected me, what I'm left with, if there's anything that's concerning, because quite often after a critical incident debrief, especially if it's a company that's been involved and it's work colleagues, it can sometimes make the team quite fragmented. So it's about negotiating that and making sure that I've got rid of all that at the end of it and I can walk away from it. So I usually have a debrief within 24 hours of leaving site. Sometimes the debriefs can go on for days. So it's just making sure that you've got that support in between, somebody you can talk to.
And who would that debrief be with? Would that be someone who's trained, or would that be through supervision, or a mixture? How would that work?
Mixture. It's other people that are qualified in critical incident debriefing, so they get what it is that you've gone into. Through supervision, I'll also do it through there, and just also talking to other therapists about if there's anything left. Like I said, I'm quite good at being able to do that and not carry it. But yeah, you can't walk away from it and think it's not going to affect you, because it does. It does. You have got to be quite robust to do it. But how I feel afterwards, it feels great that I've helped people. I've helped them through that.
And I guess that really takes it back full circle to when we first started, when you wanted to help people, because of your own, through your own therapy, you identified you wanted to help people, and you are, Karen, definitely. Yeah, you are. It's been a fascinating insight into an area maybe of therapy that isn't very well known, but I think is a growing edge, and also is in demand. We live, unfortunately, in a very, very difficult world at the moment, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better quickly. No. And regretfully, I think there'll be a lot more of the work that you've been doing. Be doing a lot more of it. So, Karen Moore, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Karen Moore. Thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, bringing us the guests who bring the good stuff. That's my new catchphrase. That is
it's very good, Ken. It's very good.
It's all in the tone of the voice. The good stuff. You joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This has been episode 282.
Yes, we started off with student services and choosing academic text. How not to get bogged down and, quite frankly bankrupted men buying books. We moved on then to ethical sustainable practice with a focus on ethical counselling from home, benefits and drawbacks. And we went into a deep dive on the practicalities of working from your own home. And then we finished with practice matters. I interviewed Karen Moore on critical incident debriefing. And before we close out today's episodes, I've got a quick favour to ask you, the listener. First, if you've enjoyed and benefited from Ken and myself's conversation today, please leave us a 5-star review on whichever platform you're tuning in from. It generally helps us reach more ears and grow our community. And secondly, if someone in your circle might benefit from the episode, why don't you share it on your social media platform? Word of mouth is so powerful, and we appreciate every share, tweet, or X as it is now, or post that brings new listeners into our community. Thank you for being such a vital part of your journey. Thank you for letting us into your journey. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.